I got the interior of this frame all set up with the epoxy. I used the quick coat to seal this interior side, which is going to be what connects to the first layer of epoxy that I use to fill in the cavity in this table. I also burned the wood, give it a little bit of character. You'll see that there's this kind of splash from the epoxy. This quick coat that I work with has to be worked really, really fast because as soon as you mix it, it starts setting up. It also gets very hot, so I spread this with my fingers using a glove, but you can still feel that heat coming right through on the as you get towards the end, and then it gets pretty hot. So because I'm working with this so fast, then it kind of splashes over. So that means I'm just going to end up having to sand this stuff off in order to get back down to the wood and get down to that even appearance throughout the entire piece of wood before I seal it. The other thing that happens when I do it like this and I set it up on these little pegs is I get a little bit of pooling as that epoxy starts coming down. I think as I get more experienced, I'll use less and less epoxy, and then it won't get that pooling. But what I have to do here is I'll just have to sand that off, and I don't think that'll be a problem. As I suspected, it didn't take a lot to get that epoxy bubbling down, but it was still more work than I really wanted to do. But I did get the bottom so I can get a nice flat seal when I pour my first layer of epoxy. Also got the sides and the tops. Now I need to re-burn this so that I can kind of touch up some of that burning. I don't want to do that after I've already got the epoxy laid in. Then I will sand this interior so that it makes a good bond with the epoxy I'm going to lay down. On future projects, I think what I'll do is I'll just tape where I expect pooling or runoff to occur, and then hopefully the epoxy adheres to the tape and I can just pull that tape right off and I won't have to do any cleanup on the wood. Or if I do have to do cleanup, it'll be very, very small. Just about ready to go here. I've got the tape laid down, sprayed that with mold release spray. Then I put silicone on the bottom of my frame, clamp that down, and I'm gonna wait and let that set up, and then I'll be ready to make that first pour. My biggest worry at this point is dust. There could be a speck of dust over in my neighbor's garage. He could have vacuumed it and his garage door be closed. And as soon as I pour that epoxy, that speck of dust is going to come over here, drop into my epoxy, and it's gonna be yelling and screaming for the rest of its life, and everybody's gonna see it. I'd really like to have a good sized cardboard box that I could turn upside down and put on top of this as it is curing, but I don't have that. I had a bit of a delay getting ready to pour the epoxy for my end table project. When I did my calculation, I realized that I did not have enough epoxy, so I had to order more. Wait for that to come in. I also got this paddle mixer, which makes things really convenient. So this has part of my epoxy already poured. You can see it's nice and smooth like glass. When I pour the rest of it on, I'll have a little bit of a bubbled appearance, and then I'll end up hitting that with the torch, take those bubbles right out. I've poured the remainder of my epoxy. You can see it's got a little bit of bubbling in the middle there. I've been using this measuring stick, marked with my depth, and I'm close enough to be exactly where I want to be. Now I'll hit this with that torch, get those bubbles right out. Back to smooth like glass. Now I just got to wait for this to cure, hope that I don't get any massive dust in there, and I am going to be ready to go for the next phase. Checking on the project, no bubbles coming through the wood, so I had a good seal on the wood, nothing leaking out the corners, so that's really nice. And haven't gotten any dust or anything in it. Although there was a little tiny piece of hair or thread, one of those little floaty things that's in the air, I was able to spot that and take it out with a popsicle stick. Everything seems to be going really well for this stage. First stage of this project complete. I really like how it's come out. although it is not perfect. I noticed that the tape underneath lifted up a little bit. I believe that's either from the heat of the epoxy or the epoxy just sliding under there. I think that's going to cause a little bit of deformation on the bottom of my project, which is going to increase my polishing time, and I might actually have to go on the back end with a light epoxy to fill in if there's any channels in there. Right here, here, and up in this area, there's a little bit of bubble forming. I was able to chase most of the bubbles as they popped up throughout this entire curing. But when these bubbles started popping up, the top layer of the epoxy was already too hard, and I wasn't able to heat the epoxy enough and make it liquid enough for those bubbles to come on up. You can also see a little bit of deformation in the epoxy, and that's when I was sitting on it with the torch trying to get to those bubbles. Right there you can see it looks like the bubbles were coming from underneath the wood where it was joining with the tape. As you can see on this project, I've got clamps on 3 sides, but not this 4th side. And that's the side that the air bubbles were coming through right at the end of the curing. I honestly didn't think I needed clamps at all, so I didn't worry about this 4th side. I guess doing it again, I would probably cut this MDF down and then clamp that 4th side, and I think that would fix that. So I'm not worried about the deformation. I'm gonna sand this layer down, then I'll put the coins on it, glue those down, and then I'll go back over with my 2nd layer of epoxy, and that will take out that deformation. I'm not really worried about the bubbles. Making this project for myself, I could accept that. Maybe I'll stick a little plastic scuba guy in there and we'll call it a feature. But if I was making this project for a friend, then I would want to get those bubbles out. So one thing I've thought about doing is coming in real carefully with a drill and drilling those holes out down where those bubbles are, and then filling in those holes that I make with the drill bit with epoxy. I think that'll work, but I probably am going to call a few people and make sure that that's a good plan. But overall, look at this project. I am really excited with how this is working out.